Howdy. Welcome to May's MasterCast. I'm your host, Ben Wiggins, and it is a warm and beautiful day in Aggieland. We are excited for today's guest. Dr. Daniel Usera is an executive assistant professor for the MBA programs at May's Business School. He teaches the business communication that trains students to write, speak, and interact impactfully. He is also a professional speaker and interview coach. Daniel loves all things related to his field, communication studies, along with psychology, philosophy, history, and any concept that ties them all together. We're going to talk about imposter syndrome. We're going to talk about storytelling frameworks in the business context and strategies for making business requests. And as always, rule number one, we're going to talk about CrossFit. Let's do it. We welcome Daniel Usera to the show. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Kyle, and just the whole MasterCast crew for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you all.
It is our pleasure to have you. Let's start by talking a little bit about imposter syndrome and identity management in new environments.
Sure. So imposter syndrome is this idea that when you enter a new environment, particularly one that is competitive or one that is among people that are who are high achievers, or even one that you enter because you had some record of achievement that was displayed, whether that was through your education or previous positions that you held, or some kind of record of achievement that got you into that environment. Imposter syndrome occurs when you enter that environment under those circumstances and you become afraid that you actually aren't qualified to be there and that you're more or less an imposter.
Yeah.
This can come from the tendency to compare yourself to others.
Sure.
So you look at the other people, everybody's really accomplished around you, and you feel like, well, the only reason I'm here is because I was lucky, or because people don't understand that one accomplishment that I had wasn't that big of a deal. And so you begin to feel like an imposter among everyone. And the ultimate fear of imposter syndrome is that one day you're going to get found out and you're going to get exposed, and everyone is going to say, oh, this person's a fake, this person's a fraud, and this person shouldn't be here. And then it's kind of like the social outcasting of you from an environment. Imposter syndrome, I think, is something that's experienced here in the business school. I can say definitely with students. I know I always have a few students who have that feeling. They get accepted into a top 25 program, depending on what rankings you look at. And they're around a lot of successful people. And they tend to compare themselves to others because that's what you kind of do when you enter a new environment. You size everyone up and you start to realize, oh, I don't have that experience. Or you're taking a class like Dr. Shetty's quantitative class and you realize, oh, these other people are good at Excel and I hardly know Excel at all. So that sense of imposter feeling starts to come out. And even myself, when I started my first semester here, I felt it. Being a younger faculty member in the program and seeing people like Dr. Mahajan and Dr. McAnally and all of those accomplishments, you can kind of feel that, man, do I belong here? Like, just with all the successful people around you. So I've always studied identity, and that was part of my doctorate, and my program was identity management and the face work. So the image that we put out in front of others in social interaction. And it just became more pronounced coming here and seeing students struggle with it, and even me having to deal with it too, to a degree. Because when you apply to this program, the admissions committee sees everything. Like, they see that you don't have a strong quantitative background per se, or they see that you don't have this consulting experience. They see all that, but they accept you anyway because they believe in you. And so when you come to business school, it's not a question of, does May's Business School believe in you? We already did when we accepted you.
Right.
It's a question of, do you believe in yourself?
Right.
And for me, like, when I was thinking about it and kind of experiencing that, like the first few months of, with, just all the programs and all the faculty and all of that. I mean, one of the things that I held on to was everything on my resume was accurate. I didn't lie about anything. So there's nothing to be found out because the hiring committee knew everything about me. They knew about my background. They knew everything that I knew. They knew everything that I didn't know. And so the question for me to figure out in the first semester, in the first year, was, what's my angle? Like, what is it that's going to make me special? And how can I leverage that to make a version of business communication that reflects me and also benefits the students too? And so throughout the year, there wasn't one main event that just alleviated it, but just having those small successes that I kept on creating for myself and meeting those goals, you eventually start to wean your way out of it. And you just have that moment where you're like, I can do this. This is here. This is me. And now I'm having fun. I'm having a lot of fun doing it. And I'm just now in my second year and it's great.
That's fantastic. And that's kind of what I was thinking toward, because you use the verb belong, and belonging can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And if someone has defined themselves by high performance among their peers and leadership among their peers, and then suddenly they're in a group where they're relative to the metrics that they find important, they're actually average or even slightly below average. Well, I think the road out of that, exactly as you said, is an adjustment to our understanding of what belong really means. Because you do, if your level of performance is average to slightly below average, that doesn't eliminate you from, like, you won't be found out and kicked out of the group. Like, no one wants to do that. But you may be down on yourself because you're like, I've always been the best. Well, maybe you're not the best anymore, and that's okay.
Yeah. And so part of imposter syndrome is this some psychology of it is sometimes people are more inclined to feel it if they've always been held as being the best at things. Maybe starting with your parents, like your parents expect you to always be the best student, and you're always expected to be the best at this, be the best at that, and so on. And you always have had to carry that identity of needing to be the best student and having to live up to that. And so when you enter an environment where you sort of become the average, but you've always been expected to hold the identity of being the best, you can start to feel that inadequacy or sense of inadequacy. Another root of imposter syndrome too is that, and this is one of the solutions too, but here's the problem that causes it, and then there's a solution as a result. One of the problems that causes imposter syndrome is you tend to dismiss your own successes. So there's a theory called attribution theory, where it says people tend to attribute reasons or causes either to internal factors relating to character, personality, or external factors, the environment, success, luck, circumstance. And what attributions theory says is that in certain situations, people tend to attribute good things to their internal character and maybe bad things to external, or vice versa.
Yeah.
If I like you, if you were to make a mistake, I might say, oh, Ben was just having a bad day. It's just, Ben's just going through a rough period. It's nothing big. If I hated you and you made a mistake, see, Ben's not
an
smart.
idiot.
Ben's an idiot.
Everyone always knew Ben was an idiot.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, it's just Ben's dumb, no, I'm not saying that, but you know what I mean? Like, that's the example though.
Yes, you are.
So that's what attribution theory, that's at least one of the tenets of it, is internal attributions you attribute to character, personality, this is who they are. External attributions you attribute it to the circumstance, something outside of somebody's control. And you can see all different configurations that can occur when you're evaluating somebody's actions or even your own actions. So let me just say one thing real fast. With imposter syndrome, what happens is when you have successes, rather than attributing it to your internal character, your drive, your motivation, you attribute it to external things. I was just lucky. Or, oh, that was just not a big deal. Or, oh, the competition wasn't that good. And so you dismiss your own basis for being in this new environment.
Right.
So the solution would be to learn to appreciate your successes regardless of the size as well.
What determines, is there any research that indicates when that switch gets flipped? Because something like the Dunning-Kruger effect would suggest that we tend to overestimate our own internal contribution to successes most of the time. But it sounds like this is a situation where the opposite is actually true. So what gives?
Yeah. So as far as the research goes in terms of that flip, I think some of it has to do with self-esteem.
Hmm.
So the Dunning-Kruger effect is true in general when people have high self-esteem. And that's kind of the argument, is people tend to overestimate some good characteristics of themselves.
Right.
But there are some situations where that comes into effect thanks to social comparison, right? So social comparison, the need to constantly compare yourself to others. So it is sort of a personality thing that makes you more inclined to give yourself internal or external attributions too. The tendency of yourself to compare yourself to other people, and also that upbringing. So it's a good question that I think there's probably even better answer to that. But those would be my inclinations anyways on that. So self-esteem and how you were brought up and just how you think about your own successes in context.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because this is kind of one of the many stories that we tell ourselves, and storytelling is kind of a specialty of yours. I think the way that we're applying storytelling to data now is particularly compelling, especially in the business world.
Yeah.
Talk with us a little bit about that, how story plays into all of that.
Yes. So facts tell, stories sell.
Yeah.
That's a Toastmasters
True statement.
truism that just comes out all the time. Facts tell, stories sell. Data is numbers, and it's graphs, it's charts. But story is the narrative that weaves all the numbers and charts together into a cohesive framework that makes it meaningful and impactful to the audience.
Mm-hmm.
So data storytelling is all about making the numbers meaningful to a particular audience at a particular time. So for a decision maker, it's not just, here are these numbers. Here's what these numbers mean for you and for the audience and the people that you're trying to attract. And here's the story behind the numbers. Because if you were to rate the MasterCast on a scale of 1 to 5 and people were to put 5, that's good. But what's the story behind the 5? And how has that 5 fluctuated in time over, if you're doing like a time series of the surveys, what's the story? So you have first you see MasterCast at the 3, and then it goes to a 5, and it goes to a 4. Data storytelling is explaining why, what happened here, and what is the takeaway of that change. So it's not just talking about what the numbers are, but why the numbers are and how the numbers are, and giving all of that surrounding context to then make data into a meaningful decision-making or impactful takeaway of sorts. So there's different techniques there's different ways to do data storytelling in the design of the graph. So what we learn in business comm is creating the graph, making it big, having good graphic highlighting of the points, the main points that you want to tell, call outs, color, sizing, having a good thesis at the top that kind of gives the takeaway. So that's done on the visual level. And then on the oral level, when you're presenting it in a presentation, let's say, it's what technique do you want to use to talk through the graph? Because what you often see in business presentations that need improvement is, okay, so here is our sales from last month. Okay, next graph, here's this, that from this previous month. And there's no like story behind it, like the why, the what, the who. So how do you talk through the graph? And so you start off with like display. Okay, so here is our sales. Here's the first 4 quarters of 2020. And on the right here, on the left, on the y-axis, here is our sales in millions. Now you notice that in the first quarter, here's where we are. Mm-hmm. And then you see that we were kind of low, but then it's like quarter 2, we kind of took a hike here. Now you might be wondering what caused that hike. Call out, what happened here is we launched our new product. And then we got to quarter 3, we see another hike because the product got advertised. And then in quarter 4. So you see what I'm saying? Like talking through the graph rather than just like, okay, here's the graph next.
Right. Well, and it accentuates the idea that in business, you're talking about one of 3 things. You're talking about a problem, you're talking about an aspiration, or you're talking about a solution. If you are not talking about one of those 3 things, you are wasting our time.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I like that.
So,
problem, aspiration, solution. That's good.
Yeah. And usually, most of the time, it's problem or solution.
Yes.
Sometimes we don't get to talk about aspirations quite as often as we'd like because I don't know. There's those tend to be bigger. And they are less changing over time, I suppose. But But yeah, problems and solutions.
Yeah. And that's interesting too, because I think we're all about transformational leadership, right? We're here about transforming organizations. I feel like that's key. And the Maze mission is about transformational leadership and transforming. You don't transform by conforming, you transform by challenging the norm.
Sure.
Aspirational speeches, aspirational ideas are what lead to that transformation because they challenge the status quo. And so one thing that I'm really trying to work more into the business comm curriculum is that aspirational type speaking and sharing of ideas of what a future could be.
Okay.
So I think that's something that's key to transformational leadership is you have to be able to convey a vision and you have to be able to convey a possible future that doesn't exist now that inspires people and motivates them to want to get behind you and help you execute that idea or that vision. Because after all, that's what entrepreneurship is. That's, I think, to drive an organization to a new height, you have to have some sense of vision of what that could look like.
There really is something to the Simon Sinek. We're not just trying to sell to people who want to buy the product we have. We want to sell to people who believe what we believe. We want to hire people who believe what we believe.
Start with why.
Yeah, exactly. Start with why. And in terms of the storytelling involved, what constitutes, from a business perspective, good story versus bad story? I can tell you what, like the Hollywood formula: inciting incident, progressive complication, crisis, climax, resolution. But if we're looking at that from a business perspective, is it the same? Is it just beginning, middle, end? How do you frame that?
That's a great question. So that's kind of one of the areas it is one of the areas that I'm actually digging more into, because I do have I don't want to say a formula, but I kind of like for business presentations, technical presentations, I do have a set formula for them based off Barbara Minto's pyramid. I don't know if you've heard of the Minto pyramid. Barbara Minto is a former McKinsey consultant, and she came up with a system basically for storytelling for technical presentations and reports. And the basic formula, you'll have to take the class if you want to go in depth, but there you go. There's my plug. Okay. So the basic formula is situation. So you set the table, here are the characters, here's the situation, here's the complication. So here is the status quo, here is what we know. Now the complication is, here is some contradicting fact or something that we don't know, something that is complicating the status quo.
It forces us to take action.
Yes, that leads to a question.
Okay.
That leads to a question. So for example, you could have a situation like Tesla's stock price is 892 currently. I don't know if it is, but let's just pretend it is. Okay, so Tesla's stock price is 892. That's the situation. The complication is this. Tesla just announced that there's going to be production delays until December 2022. Okay, so situation, Tesla's stock price is high. Complication, they just announced something that's probably not good.
Right.
Now, there's all kinds of questions that we could ask based off that situation and that complication together. We could ask, well, why did they have the production delays? We could ask, well, what is that going to do to their stock price? We could ask, well, why was their stock price so high in the first place? That would lead to them having these.
That's the question I'm asking.
Okay. So there's 3 different questions that you could ask based off that situation complication. So part of the SCQA approach is you got to pick a question and you pose that question.
Okay.
So you'll say, maybe in my case, and maybe in your case, why was Tesla's stock price so high in the first place? Or maybe in my case, what will that do to their stock price?
Right.
So that's the question. And then I give the answer. The answer is, well, we project that there's going to be a 10% loss over the next year. And here's how. Data. So that's kind of how you open the presentation more or less, and you do it that way. And there's more to it than that, but that's just kind of the Maze MasterCast preview approach. Now, to answer your question about what about like creative Hollywood type storytelling? So, because that's the thing. When we say storytelling, I think a lot of images come to people's minds. Like some people, when they first hear storytelling, they think like, oh, bedtime story or Hollywood storytelling. And so they don't see what that has to do with business. I actually do think, and I suspect that there actually is quite a bit of potential overlap. And there's techniques that Hollywood uses. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one, but I think there is so I'm reading a book right now. It's called, it's by Robert McKee. I think it's just called Story by Robert McKee. Story by Robert McKee. And I'm looking at like plot, anti-plot, all the things. Like he has a system, and that's what I like.
Plot is character. That he's also got some directorial stuff in there that's pretty fascinating.
Oh wow, yeah. So
Story is great.
I'm like on page 100, but I've been reading through that book, and I've been reading it with an eye towards what can I take from that and maybe apply to data or business storytelling, because I feel like there are techniques that are very applicable to business that just haven't been brought over, because people tend to just business storytelling stays over there and Hollywood storytelling stays over here. And so what I've been trying to do with my background, having a liberal arts background and then being in the business school here, is figure out what can I take and create something new from both sides that could be better than what's being taught over here, and also more useful from what's being taught over here for business purposes. So at least as far as personal storytelling goes, I think one thing that I've taken from Robert McKee that I've talked about with PMBA. So when you're telling your story, so we're just not talking data story, but just a regular story about yourself. The tendency, especially in business, is to want to talk about your perfections, right? And all of the achievements that you've had, right? And I've accomplished this, and I worked at this company, and I raised this amount of money, and I did this and that.
And nobody cares.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like, now, it's not the case that that's always bad by any means. Like there's times when you need to do that, probably like in a job interview, things like that, where you need to share all your accomplishments and play yourself up. But what Robert McKee was talking about was what makes a story interesting, a personal biography interesting, isn't all the things that went well. It was all the things that you struggled with and went wrong and overcame.
Right. It's reversals.
And so what people don't relate to perfection as much as they relate to imperfection. Mm-hmm. So when I started with PMBA, like the very first day, normally what people do is they talk about how they've done this and they've done that. And professor, I've done this and this. I just told them, I told them a little bit about my background. And then I said, but you know what? I know that I'm like the youngest faculty member you're going to have in this program, and there's struggles with that. I know what it's like to be written off because of your age. I know what it's like when you're new and you have people who are older than you and you don't, like, I know it. And they understand it too, because they're about the same age as me, and they really understood that. And so they were like, in my first class with them, they were like, you really relate to us really well. Like, how did you do that? Like, basically. And I was like, well, people relate to imperfection more than they relate to perfection. So doing something like that, I think that can maybe, whoever's watching this, if you're trying to tell a compelling story about yourself that's relatable and really has an impact, think about what imperfections or challenges that you've had in your career and figure out how you've overcame those and share that story about yourself.
Right. And that's there for everyone. Like, even if you've had a pretty linear path to success, there's still, once you get specific enough, there's still some really low moments that you had to figure out a way around. Like I always tell people when we talk about the question that is, what is the most unique piece of your life story? Sometimes people will qualify it right away by saying, well, it's probably not unique, but, and I always stop them and say, then let's get more specific. Let's find intersections.
Yes.
Of things that are unusual, and look for the uniqueness in that way. Look, and you can do the same thing to find the adversity. You can find intersections of unusual things. You can go to very, very small moments. Sometimes all the power is in like a very small moment.
Yes.
That's where
and I think so. If we can talk about Robert McKee for a second.
Yeah.
It may not. So I just talked about challenges and struggles, but one of the bases of story for Robert McKee is change. So every scene, there's a change of sorts, right? So
the arc, as they call it. Yeah.
But even like in a scene, something might change. Like John might start off, undressed, and then he gets dressed. That's a change. And then he goes from ready to unready, or unready to ready.
Yeah. And then there's always a collision of some kind before the change.
Exactly. And then you can think about like the whole arc itself. Star Wars, Luke Skywalker changes from, guy in the desert to Jedi. Harry Potter, kid in a closet all the way to wizard. Breaking Bad, chemistry teacher,
crime kingpin.
crying king. So change, like that's one of the bases of story is change. I do think that I'm not ready to systematically be like, this is the answer, but these are things that I'm thinking about. So I'm just thinking out loud on the MasterCast. But I do think that concept of change, and maybe if it's not even something you've struggled with, but just talking about how you've changed or something that has changed you could also be part of your compelling biography of yourself to your subordinates or to your colleagues, all of that. And I gave the example in class. Imagine a story that goes like this. John is in a hotel and he wakes up at 6:00 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
He is getting ready. He knows at 6:00 he has to start getting ready for his job interview. He feels good. He gets ready, gets dressed, takes a shower, and
then all of a sudden, a gang of ninjas breaks into his hotel room. Oh, sorry.
Not improv. Not in this story.
My bad.
But yeah, but that's good. That would be a good one, I think. But he takes a shower, he puts on his suit, and he says, I'm ready for this interview. He goes to the interview and he gets the job. Okay, so that's story A. So here's story B. It's 6:00 p.m. Robert wakes up and he realizes he was supposed to be up at 5:30. He's getting ready for his interview and he's going through the answers in his head and he's not sure if he can do it. As he goes to the shower, he takes a shower, he runs more answers. They're not coming out right. He doesn't feel like he's ready to do this. At 7:00, as he's getting ready to leave, his phone lights up.
It's a gang of ninjas. Oh, sorry.
The ninjas pop out of the phone. Okay, so the phone lights up. And when he looks at the phone, it's a message from the girl he went on a date with a week ago.
Mm-hmm.
And when he opens the message says, "You got this," smiley face.
Yeah.
So John looks at the message.
Wait, we're on Robert now.
Robert. Robert looks at the message and he smiles and he says, "I got this," put the phone away, and he walks to his interview confident.
Okay.
And he gets the job.
Huh.
So story A or story B? Which one do you think is more compelling?
Well, yeah, it's story B. Story A is the linear one. Story B has reversals.
Has a change, right? Has change. And so like reversals, that kind of thing. And so thinking about that in terms of maybe data storytelling, that's something I just haven't had enough time to think about. Okay, how could I take that concept and apply it to data storytelling and then maybe make something more compelling? Obviously, I think there's some real applications too to personal storytelling, interviewing, those kinds of things. But that's the kind of stuff I play with as a communication guy.
Here's something that may help. What you can do is if you're looking for a high point at the end of your story, then what you're doing is you're kind of sifting the data as you look at it for where's the lowest point. Whatever it is, you're just trying to find, all right, what is the biggest inflection between that and whatever is at the end of my story? And you kind of learn to, yeah, it's there. I know it's there. Or, it's over here, wherever it may be. But it's always you're just trying to find the biggest stretch between the two because that's what's most compelling.
Yes.
But I'd love to talk more offline about this. So in terms of using stories for persuasion and social influence, this kind of what the world needs, changing the world, making the world a better place, advancing the world's prosperity. That's stuff we spend a lot of time thinking about. Any thoughts on how our students and faculty and staff and former students and friends from the community can do things like that?
When it just comes to persuasion generally, there's a whole topic that's on my mind here, which is emotional and social intelligence. So there's emotional intelligence, which is the management of your emotions and recognition of it in others.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's social intelligence, which I see as being aware of people's identity goals in an interaction and learning how to communicate according to those goals so that people stay open to you and not become defensive towards you. Because when defenses go up, people are more likely to resist any kind of persuasion attempts, even if the persuasion attempt makes sense in all sense of the logical perspective. But just because they feel attacked or because they feel like you are talking down to them or whatever, they resist it, but they use.
Right.
So one of the things that we just talked about in PMBA weekend was different strategies of making requests. And there's 5 different ones according to politeness theory, and they all have different emphases on, do you want to just be very direct? Please revise this report and get it to me by 5:00 p.m. tomorrow, versus something that's more oriented towards their identity as a person. Ben, I know you worked really hard on this and that, you're an expert in this field. I've noticed a couple of areas that you might want to revisit. Can you take a look at them? So compare the first one. Please revise this according.
Could you not jack up the next one, Ben?
Yeah. Or something that's more negative face. So negative face meaning less, it respects your autonomy. So a positive face is your desire for approval and inclusion.
Yeah.
So when I give you a compliment, usually it's a positive face redress. So Ben, you're doing a great job hosting this show. That's a positive face. Like, because presumably you want to be seen as a good host. We can talk about complexities of that. Like, because what if, for example, you didn't want to be seen as a good host and I called you a good host? Or what if I said, Ben, yeah, I just think you have nice shoes. That's it. Like that's it. Like that might be, depending on what the circumstances.
I like your shoes too.
Oh, well, thank you. So we're shoe bros now. All right. So that's positive face. So negative face is about autonomy. So I might say, hey, Ben, I know you're really busy right now, but just when you get a second, I've made a couple of edits. I don't think it should take long. When you get a chance, can you do that for me? So that compared to number 1, compared to number 2, compared to number 3 is very heavy on, I don't want to impose on you.
Okay.
Yeah. And then number 4 is the indirect request. So this would be something like, I'd have to think of one. It's a little bit more challenging, but like it would be something like, hey, Ben, did you see Kyle's report? Did you see how well designed it was and how all his numbers added up? What do you think? And then like, that's kind of an implied, like, you kind of, it's very implied.
Ben, it would be great if your report looked like Kyle's report.
Yeah, something like that. So that, like, I never asked you, but right. I just kind of implied it. And then the idea is you pick up, so that's the indirect request. And then of course, the 5th option is just avoidance. So I would just make the edits myself and not even ask you because maybe I'm too afraid to, because I don't want to hurt your feelings, or I just think that you wouldn't be able. So there's that. So just basic requesting and directives. And then you have to think about, is this an upstream request versus a downstream versus a side stream? Those kinds of things, or an external partner. The nature of your request is going to change according to power differences, how well you know the person.
Slipstream request. I made that up. Sorry.
Okay. I was like,
how well you know the partner. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Okay. Yeah. So that's all politeness theory. So literally in PMBA, we had a scenario and we talked about what would be the best way, or some combination of the strategies to request a colleague.
Yeah.
So now we're talking side stream right now.
Yes.
How would you ask a colleague to revise something? And then we changed it. What if it was your manager who made mistakes?
Mm-hmm.
How would you ask your manager in an email? And we put it in an email circumstance, but even in a face-to-face, it would still apply. How would you ask your manager to revise something? Would you go more direct? Would you do something that's more? So these are the kinds of things. And depending on how you do it, if you ask the wrong way, you might get a no, or they might not do it in the way that you want them to do it. So it's all about knowing the person, knowing the relationship, and knowing the techniques. So you can decide as a communicator yourself, what is the best technique in this scenario?
My solution to everything is to write a 7,500 word email, put if you're bored with this, skip to the end, and then just put the very direct version at the end.
TLDR.
Right, exactly. Kyle will confirm all of this. Okay, so
you got to send me a sample, and I can send that to. We'll analyze it.
I'm not sure they want to see it. But
is this indirect or was this direct?
Right. Okay, so we talked briefly about job interviews. Any tips for people who are going into a job interview?
Yeah, that's a whole couple weeks right there. Workshops is study the job posting and study the company.
Mm-hmm.
And when you study the job posting, study all of the duties and the responsibilities and the qualifications. And when you go through each line, what you should try to do is think of a story, not just like a fact, but a story that you can tell for each line of the job requirement. And if you don't have a story, talk about a related experience that you had. And if you don't have a related experience, talk about it hypothetically. If you were in this scenario, what would you do?
Mm-hmm.
Because If you don't know, at least have a plan is the idea. What you don't want to do is, I don't have a story, I don't have related experience, so I guess I don't know. Have a hypothetical then,
Right.
in that case. And I would also say, there's only one question. Like whenever I do interview coaching, we prepare for mainly one question. I mean, we do prepare for others, but this is like the key question. The key question for all job interviews, the universal meta question, the question of, not meta, but just the question of questions is, why should we hire you? Practice that question. What if they just straight up ask you, why should we hire you? So
You shouldn't hire me. You should hire Kyle.
Okay, so why should we hire Kyle? Why should we hire you? Okay, I'm just kidding. So, but ultimately, that's the job interview, right? Is that question. Why should we hire you? But instead of asking you directly, maybe they will, but a lot of times they don't. They ask all these sub questions of that, right? So to answer that question, what I usually tell people is you got to have selling points. So just like in sales, you have your USPs, like your unique selling propositions.
Sure.
Essentially the same idea. What are those three things? I always say threes. I like things in threes. So what are those three key reasons that make you specifically, uniquely qualified to this position? So it's partially, so what I usually recommend are 2 hard and 1 soft. So not Taco Bell tacos, but like 2 hard skills and 1 soft skill.
Yeah.
So usually something along the lines of experience. You probably have some related experience. Experience is an easy sell because people understand it. They understand why it matters. But don't just talk about experience, talk about success. So when you're talking about your experience, don't just say, I have 15 years experience doing this. The thing is, experience, there's a difference between experience and success. There's a difference between experience and expertise.
True.
Experience is just showing up, right? Experience is, I was there. But you could be experienced, but not necessarily good at the job. There's a lot of people who've been in the NFL for 15 years, third string quarterbacks, right? Like, so they're experienced, but they're not the best, right? So you got to think about expertise when you talk about experience. So instead of saying, I have 15 years experience leading teams, you want to think of it as, I have a 15-year successful track record growing teams, helping teams deliver key results such as X, Y, and Z. And I have, and helping teams, and then whatever the third thing you want it to be. So you want to be able to talk about your experience as not just, I've done these things, but that I've delivered results under this framework.
Sure.
So that's the first. And then a second hard skill I usually like to go to is something relating to the technical skills themselves of the job. And then the third selling point usually is a soft thing like adaptability or communication skills. I mean, there's a lot of things you can claim. So whatever is your best soft skill that also relates to the position well is what I usually recommend for a third selling point. So selling points, people are multifaceted. And you probably, Ben and Kyle, everybody who's watching, you might have 7 or 8 good selling points, but you can only probably talk about 3. And there's probably 3 that are most relevant to the position. So for every position, you have to think about, what are my best selling points for that position and cater them to that position? Because you have to not just sell yourself, you have to fit into the role. And so that's where adapting to your audience. So one of the prime directives of communication, Aristotle, is adapt to your audience, right? And so the job market itself is an adaptation exercise. So when you're applying for jobs online, generic resumes are probably not the best way to go. You got to adapt. You got to adapt.
And in the name of that, can I also make a case for mirroring in the interview? Matching your
nonverbals, yeah, all that,
energy,
sure,
things like that. I think that also really makes a difference.
Yeah,
All right, rule number 1 of CrossFit Club: always talk about CrossFit.
Yeah, so we're both for the viewers. Ben and I both do CrossFit. We discovered on Saturday, so we'll be working. I just started 2 weeks ago, and I just joined CrossFit Aggieland, and it's been a really good environment. It's a community of people as opposed to working out by yourself, which is just good in general. But more philosophically, what I love about CrossFit is that it's a group of people doing a really hard thing, because the things we do in CrossFit are hard, like doing these lifts, and we're doing all these reps and burpees and all these things. doing really hard things, but these hard things are really good for you, right? These things are making us stronger. They're making us faster. They're making us more agile and energetic. And the third thing, so it's people doing really hard things that are better for them. So those are the two things. The third thing, and this is the third thing that I love, no one complains. No one complains in CrossFit.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing these hard things. We know that they're trying to make us better, and no one complains. And instead, people encourage each other to do these hard things.
Yeah.
Not once. I mean, I don't know, maybe in your career too, but like not once have I heard anyone when we're doing CrossFit, why do we have to do this? Like, why can't we just do this instead? Like, can we just cut it down? No, we just do our work. We do our workout. And by the end, you feel good. And it's like, that's my environment. And I want the business school, like I want all my business students to be in that same way. Because everything we ask you to do in my class, and I'm sure in all the other classes, like we're asking you to do it to make you better.
Yeah.
And it's like when you can see that that's the goal, and that's everyone's goal, every professor's goal in the business school is to make you better. And these things are hard. You won't have a reason to complain. It's going to be hard. Yeah, it's hard. There's times when you want to like let out some emotion, but it's like, but you understand like it's making you better. So that's what I love about CrossFit, just being in that environment, just hard things, no complaints. Everyone's doing their thing. I'm struggling, I'm sweating, but I'm enjoying it. Like I like getting my butt kicked. Like that's why I go to CrossFit, to get my butt kicked.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
really
Ben.
Appreciate your time.
It's been a lot of fun.
Hey, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the episode. For takeaway number 1, imposter syndrome, the lens I saw this through as a new dad is in how we can avoid setting our kids up for imposter syndrome. And it really comes back to comparison. Kids are going to compare themselves to others, but instead of leaning into that, we can lean away from it. There's always going to be someone more talented, smarter, better looking, more athletic. The challenge is to be the best we ourselves can be and to complement our kids and our mentees relative to themselves, not to each other. For our second takeaway, the crucial nature of skilled storytelling really stood out to me. Every time we talk about anything, we are always trying to get to why and what do we do about it? Data that doesn't lead to assessment and action is a waste of everyone's time. Also, I thought the idea of maximum stretch, maximum inflection or reversal, finding the point in the story that is most opposite to the tone of the ending, that is really helpful in determining where the most compelling story arc is. For our third takeaway, the idea of different approaches to making business requests was really interesting. As a business owner, I've been forced to take a more direct approach to business requests, maintain positivity, give people freedom to work, but I can't be collaborative and ask questions every time. Sometimes stuff just has to get done. And now I will close us with a quote from Naval. Become the best in the world at what you do. Keep refining what you do until this is true. Thanks for listening. Gig 'em.
Thank you for watching. We appreciate your support. Drop us a like below and feel free to leave a comment if you wish. We appreciate positivity and constructive feedback. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on our latest episodes and bonus content. You can also take us on the road using your favorite podcast listening app. We have those linked below. If you'd like to know more about Mays Business School or our guests, visit mays.tamu.edu/podcasts. Talk with you soon.